Did you know using math, you can actually calculate how much yarn you're going to use for a project before even making it with a gauge swatch? I'm going to walk through the exact math on how you can figure out how much yarn you're going to use for a project, which is super cool. This is going to be pretty math heavy, but I promise I'm going to make it really easy to understand. And also link down below, I have a few resources as well that you don't have to do the math yourself for. Hello everyone, my name is Hunter May. I am the owner of May Crochets. I am a pattern designer as well as a software engineer, and I love the math and logic behind things. Some brief things really quickly. Number one, I'm a little sick right now, so I apologize profusely if I sound really weird. And number two, I'm actually at my parents' house. So if you're wondering where the heck I am, that's why I'm doing laundry because our dryer is bad. You probably didn't care, but if you've watched my videos before, you're maybe wondering. If you're new here, hi, welcome. You probably are wondering why I even mentioned that, but I just feel like I had to. I don't know. This video is for you. One, if you are a pattern designer and you're trying to figure out how to calculate the estimated yardage for every single size in your pattern. This is also maybe up and coming pattern designers just trying to figure out how things work. Or you're just a maker, but you like to make your own and design your own things, but you never know how much yarn to buy for it. I'm gonna help you through that and figuring out how much yarn you actually need for a project that you're just making up and you haven't even made yet. As a maker and a pattern designer, I am absolutely terrible at estimating the amount of yarn I'm gonna need for a project. I end up overbuying all the time and sometimes underbuying, but most of the time fully overbuying the amount of yarn I need. So this just gives a better concrete idea of how much yarn you're gonna use for a project. And on top of that, the other thing this is really nice for is using stash yarn. So let's say that you have a project in mind and you want to use the yarn that you already own. This is really great in figuring out if the amount of yarn that you have is going to work for the project you have in mind. So let's get right into it. So there are a few things that you're going to need to calculate this information. First thing you're going to need is a gauge swatch. So I have this little Tunisian crochet gauge swatch here that I made in preparation for a project coming up. But I'm not sharing anything about it yet, but I'm really excited. And then you're also going to need the yarn label that this yarn is associated with. Specifically, you need the yards or meters information and then the grams or ounces. You can pick either one of each side, just whatever you're wanting to calculate. So if you want to calculate how many yards, you're going to need yards. Meters. If you just want to know the amount of grams or the amount of ounces of yarn, you need those as well. Then you're gonna need some sort of scale to weigh this gauge. And because we're working with smaller gram ounce measurements, we need more like a kitchen scale. I actually use a precision scale just because sometimes I make small gauges that don't even get picked up by a kitchen scale. So I use my precision scale. I would recommend, if you are a pattern designer, buying a precision scale. Not really necessary if you're a maker, you could just easily use your kitchen scale for this, but the precision scale helps immensely, especially if you're calculating all the different sizes in your pattern for yardage. Precision scale just gives you much more accurate results. And finally, the last thing that you need, it's kind of a complex thing, we'll go into it, and that is the total amount of stitches the project that you're making has. Now, this can be really complicated depending on the pattern. If you're just making a blanket, pretty simple. It's just the area of a square. So you take the amount of rows, the amount of stitches, multiply them together, and that's the total amount of stitches. But if you're, say, making a raglan sweater, that can be a lot more complicated because you're increasing, so every row is gonna have a different amount of stitches and you don't wanna have to add them all up. That's a lot of work. So you can always like take the average. The total amount of stitches doesn't need to be extremely precise. The more precise, the more accurate of a yardage or meterage amount of yarn calculation is, but it's not like you absolutely have to. When you think about calculating yarn with math, it's not a perfect world. Our tension might change throughout our project. We tie two skeins together, so we use a little bit more yarn there. So it's never gonna be absolutely perfect, but this is gonna give us the best results possible for figuring this out. So now that we know all the information that we need, let's go over just a little example problem, how much yarn I would need with this gauge specifically to make a scarf of a specific size. So let's go through it. Okay, so this is the information that we currently know so far. So my gauge, this gauge right here, is 18 rows tall in 4 inches, and you're just gonna have to take my word for it. And it's 19 stitches wide by 4 inches. And when I weighed this on my precision scale, it was 9.6 grams. Now my yarn information from my yarn label for this yarn is 110 yards and 50 grams. Like I said, there's gonna be a meters information, there's gonna be an ounces information, but since I weighed my gauge in grams, I need to get the grams information from my yarn. And since I want to calculate how many yards my project is gonna use, I need to grab the yards information. So if I measured this in ounces, I would need the ounces of the yarn. And if I wanted the meters, I would grab the meters. So you wanna make sure that throughout this whole thing, that you stay in the same units. That way everything cancels out nicely, which I will show you once we do the math here. So now our next thing that we need to figure out is the size of the project that I want to make. We'll walk through actually how to calculate stitches too really quickly, because that sounds fun. I'm gonna make a scarf that is, I'm gonna say it's 10 inches wide. So that's gonna be my stitches by 60 inches tall. So that's gonna be my rows. So now let's calculate really quickly the amount of rows I need. If you remember algebra, we're gonna kind of set up an equation. So we have 18 rows in 4 inches. In that, we don't know how many rows I need, but I know I need it 60 inches tall. So then we can multiply these two together. So we have 18 rows times 60 inches is equal to 4 inches times this X measurement. This is a times here, I was trying to make it small. And then divide by 4 on both sides, 4 inches. The inches end up canceling, so we're left with rows. So our rows calculation equals 18 times 60 divided by 4, 270 rows. And we can do the same exact thing with the stitches. And I'll just do that really quickly here to save time. And when you do get a number like this, I always usually round up. So I'm gonna say 48 stitches. So that's the size of my scarf to make it 10 inches wide. So this is our 10 inches. And 60 inches tall with this gauge here. So now we calculate the total amount of stitches, because that's how we need to figure out our yarn usage. So our total stitches is equal to the total amount of stitches in our scarf. And to figure that out, it's the area of our entire scarf. So our scarf is just a row calculation and a stitches calculation. So it's just a rectangle here. So we can just multiply the width times the height to get the full area. So that means our total stitches is 270 times 48. And that equals 12,960 stitches. So we're gonna calculate how much yarn I need with this gauge to work 12,960 stitches. We have all the information we need now. So let's start calculating. So the very first thing we need to calculate is this constant value. And it seems a little weird, it's gonna be a little funky, but our constant is essentially the total amount of grams that one stitch weighs. So what we do is we take our total weight of our gauge, so it's 9.6 grams, and we're gonna divide that by the area of our gauge. Same like we did for the scarf, the area of a square is the width times height. So our area of our gauge is 342. So that means we have 342 stitches in our entire gauge here. So this here has 342 stitches, which seems really crazy. The constant value is always going to become a very, very large decimal value. So this is 9.6 divided by the 342 we found, which is equal to this very, very large decimal value. So what this means, if we get our units here, I'm not gonna write all of it, is this is how many grams one stitch weighs. So you're probably wondering what does that even do to help us? Now let's calculate how many grams 12,960 stitches takes of yarn. So we'll say the yarn in grams because I'm working with grams. We're gonna take the total amount of stitches that we have. So in our scarf of what we're trying to figure out. So this 12,960 stitches, and we're gonna multiply that by our constant value of 0.02807 grams per stitches. So our stitches cancel out and we're left with grams. So if we multiply these two together, so I already have this really long constant in my calculator, I'm gonna times it by the 12,960. And we're left with this decimal value, which I usually like to round up just because we don't wanna deal with this. So the total amount of grams of yarn that we need for this scarf is 364 grams. So you could definitely just stop right here. If you prefer viewing your yarn in gram estimates, that's totally fine. I prefer yards for some reason. So I'm going to calculate how many yards of yarn this grams measurement is. So yarn in yards is equal to, we need to cancel our grams and make it yards. So we're gonna take the 364 grams times it by the amount of yards in our yarn and divide it by the grams. So times it by 110 yards and then divide by 50 grams. So then the grams cancel out and we're left with yards. So it's 364 times 110 divided by 50. And so this is the total amount of yards I would need of my yarn to make this scarf. And that is how you do the math to figure out how much yarn you're gonna use for a project before you even make it. I hope the math was pretty straightforward. I know I promised that I'd make it pretty easy. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I do have some resources down below for this. So the first resource is a made to measure pattern that I go over more in this video here. So if you want to check that out, it's called my square stitch calculator. So it's a single PDF and it will calculate the stitches and rows of any measurements, width and height, and also will calculate the total amount of yarn you're going to use once you weigh your gauge. And this can be literally any square, rectangle type of project that just needs two measurements, width and height. And then the next resource is a paid resource. It's called my pattern planner. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and this is really nice for up and coming pattern designers, and you just need help with doing the math around pattern grading and figuring out things like this where you're estimating the yarn usage. So in this Excel spreadsheet, you can actually type in your gauge information, the yarn information, any stitch multiples. So if you need to make the stitch count an even number or has to be like a multiple of 4 or something, you can type that in. And then you can input as many measurements as you would like with as many sizes. So if we think about a sweater hopefully has extra small through 5X. And then through every one of those sizes, we're gonna need a chest circumference, an arm circumference, things like that. You can type the measurement of every single one of those measurements, mark whether or not it's a stitch or row calculation, and then the Excel spreadsheet will automatically calculate those for you. And then because patterns are complicated, you'll have to do the math and figuring out how many total stitches are in each size. But once you do that, the Excel spreadsheet will automatically calculate the estimated yards or meters of whatever you typed in at the top for you. So it's super nice. You don't have to do this math yourself, but at least now you know how to do it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And this is just your reminder that when it comes to crochet and knitting, there is so much math involved. And even if you don't like math, but you love crochet and knitting, you can't really avoid it. I'm sorry, but you can't. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye.
I wish I could leave my skin behind in this old rented room, float my way across the great divide and be buried